of the Policy Subcommittee meeting. This meeting is being recorded. So first up on our agenda today is approval of the minutes of August 12th. Would anyone like to move the minutes?
Yeah, I'll move it.
All right, thank you, Andy. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Valerie? Valerie? Your vote?
Yes.
Yes. Andy?
Yes.
Jennifer?
Abstain.
And I also vote yes. So next up, we are going to be reviewing a policy on vaccinations for staff. We are joined by Dave Gayshock, who has kind enough to be present, even though he's got some soccer coaching duties that start soon. So I'm going to turn things over to you for some introductory remarks based on your thoughts on the draft. And if you can summarize for us, perhaps what panel 4 is thinking about the different types of testing. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, David. So just to be clear, I'm going to summarize here thoughts that I've gathered from various members of panel 4. We have not had a formal debate or vote on this issue, so just take it in that understanding. I think the summary is there is widespread, not unanimous, but widespread support among panel 4 members for at least a staff vaccination requirement. And I would say that among the significant majority of panel 4 members that I've gotten the sense of that support that, the sense is that it should be as broad as possible with exceptions as narrow as possible. Obviously, everyone recognizes that there will be some potential for individual medical situations that may require a medical exemption from such a policy, and are totally support that. We also recognize that it's certainly possible that there might be an individual religious belief that might conflict with vaccination, and in that case would be supportive of an exception there too. I think the general sense of panel members is that as close to that line as the school committee is able to come, we would recommend the better. So with as little flexibility for voluntary opt-outs, I think the panel generally would support probably no flexibility for voluntary opt-outs, but as close as you can come to that as possible would be the sense of most panel members. I think that panel members are mixed as to the efficacy and advisability of testing as a substitute for vaccination. Hence the recommendation from the significant majority of panel members that vaccination be required as widely as possible. To the extent testing is being used to cover the remainder, whatever that remainder of our staff may be who's not vaccinated for one reason or another, that testing should be frequent, I think, and should be not create additional incremental burden on Tricia and her team and the folks who are supporting the testing program, because that's already a heavy lift. Particularly not for voluntary opt-outs. To the extent you are of a mind to allow staff members to voluntarily opt into a testing regime as opposed to vaccination, which most panel 4 members would not recommend, even more so would emphasize that any such testing in that scenario should be the responsibility of the of individuals to obtain, as opposed to the central testing team to provide. Just because of, and this is folks' medical, professional judgment combined with experience in how heavy a lift the testing program has been for Tricia and the nursing team and others last year. I would say beyond that, vaccination is an important pillar. It's among the most important pillars, if not the most important pillar of our overall safety strategy. And we would recommend that to the extent folks are not, I saw the effective date on the draft policy, and I think our recommendation would be start now, right? Anyone who's not if the committee were to, and the school committee were to adopt a vaccination policy as of this week or sometime soon, it should take effect immediately, with testing requirements taking effect immediately for whatever, for anyone not vaccinated. Even if folks need some time to get fully vaccinated, who are not right now, totally appreciate that and support that effort. There should be testing in the meantime to accomplish that, because we're already dealing right now with a window of where vaccination would be a helpful mitigation measure, and is a helpful mitigation measure. And that's just as needed now as it likely will be in November. So that's I think the overall, one other thing to mention is that antigen testing, I think there's a wide range of views on the panel as to what the right mix of testing would be, or to what extent testing is even a substitute for vaccination. And as I said, the panel's generally of the view that it's not as good a substitute. But to the extent we're using testing for anyone who's exempt from the vaccination requirement, it should be a minimum of at least one PCR test per week, or at least 2 rapid antigen tests per week to provide equivalent coverage. In an ideal world, I think it would be, I would love to see it, if for anyone who's vaccine exempt, to be 1 PCR plus 1 or 2 rapid antigen a week, given the fact that we have some indication that the timeline from exposure to potential contagiousness with Delta is potentially quite short, only a couple of days. So that's a summary of, I think, where most of the panel sits right now. We can discuss this and provide more detailed recommendations as soon as Friday. But hopefully that gives you something to go on now, and happy to answer questions.
All right, are there any questions for Dave? Jennifer?
Hi, Dave. Thanks for joining us. Are you able to elaborate at all on panel 4's sort of widespread support for staff? And I noticed that it didn't say staff and students. Is there any discussion about that? And maybe that's not for today, but maybe that's not within the parameters of the policy we're talking about. But I would just be interested, if we don't have that sort of opinion, if we could get that, maybe when you guys meet on Friday. I would be interested in that. I think that is, so there's that. And then I'm not sure if this is a question for you, Dave, or for staff, but have we or can we offer a vaccine clinic to staff? I've noticed that an email went out for students, and I didn't know if staff were able to access that. So I'm not sure who that is. And then David Perlman, I have a couple of questions I think maybe more directed for you. So I'll stop for now.
I can jump in and say the vaccine clinics are open to everyone. Staff, students, parents, family members. If you're not vaccinated, you are welcome. We will not turn anyone away.
That's great.
And 100% behind that. The more access we can provide to vaccines, the better. In terms of, to your question, Jennifer, your entirely fair one about what about students? I think there is somewhat less developed view among the panel in terms of requirements for students. I think that there likely will be support, at least out to the boundaries of the current FDA full as distinct from the emergency use authorization for younger students. I suspect that level of support is going to continue to grow as we get more data and as FDA gets sufficiently satisfied about risk profile to continue to drop the age for the EUA lower, and also to ultimately, hopefully, fully approve for younger individuals. So I think my sense is that the panel's likely headed in that direction. I think it's just a little bit less clear cut in terms of views already, as folks are waiting for a few additional pieces of information or FDA action to come into place.
Great, thank you. I've just been thinking a lot about, if staff are vaccinated, obviously students can still spread it and bring it from home and things like that. So I would just be interested in more information information on student vaccinations, and I know only one of the three is FDA fully approved at this point. So I was expecting that we may not be in a position to make those decisions, but I'd like to continue that conversation.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, it's only 16 and up, right? It's not 12 and up, right? It's not 12 and up.
Correct. The FDA approval only goes, to my knowledge, down to 16 years old for Pfizer, and everything else in younger ages, as well as the other vaccines, is still an emergency use authorization at the moment, although hopefully that will continue to progress.
Andy?
Yeah, can anyone clarify how much like a single school district can actually mandate in terms of student vaccination if there's no action at the state level about it? I mean, we're not allowed to decline to educate somebody just because they won't be vaccinated, right? That's kind of up to the state. So, you know, we may not actually have the power to require it of students. Is there anybody who knows more about this than I do?
I think that's a great question. I'm not sure of the answer, but I know historically we have not mandated anything that wasn't state mandated. And I would expect that the state will be mandating it when they can, but I don't know the true answer.
That does match my understanding as well, Andy. I think that is a reason why we're not prepared at this moment to move forward with a vaccine mandate for students, but it is something that I've been in touch with our state representatives in Brookline about this matter, and I'm hoping to receive some prompt feedback from them about what state action, if any, will be taken in this respect. I do want to assure the general public that even if we do not move forward on a mandate for student vaccinations at this time, that does not mean that we won't do that at some other time, hopefully very soon. But we do need to work in concert with others on this. We can't act unilaterally. Helen?
So can I?
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So in the meantime, Trish, you do have statistics on how many students have been vaccinated, correct?
We do, but we are having some trouble with our electronic health record system. We use school health management, and we've seen some inconsistencies in what our data is compared to the MIIS. So I think we probably have more students vaccinated than we are showing in our records currently. We have pretty good data, but it's not perfect. I would say we're somewhere in the 70% range, and I'm guessing we're higher.
So
Of eligible students.
Right. And that's the important piece. But is there a way of parents notifying their school nurse?
Yes, and we've asked them to, and we will continue to do that. There's so much information coming at parents that we're gonna do a focus on a couple of the school health things, and we'll include that. But I thought even waiting a little bit, because there's just so much right now.
And somehow to make it easy for them to, show the proof of vaccination. I'm not sure exactly in what way to do it securely, but I think that would go a long way, and that we would be, we'd be able to cross-reference.
Right, and we do that, yeah, so they can share with us as they always have. You have to provide immunizations to start school, the required immunization, so they've always supplied that. And we can do that with them, and we will. And we're asking for that, but it's not required, so some are sharing it. We have access to some to MIIS. So we have a good amount of data, but it's not perfect.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for all you do.
Do we have any other questions? Jennifer?
Sorry, David. Just on the policy in general, and not necessarily for like panel 4 type of questions, but could you do you know if we've consulted thoroughly with the district on the wording and the language of the policy draft, as well as I was curious if there'd been contact with the BEU as well about it.
There have been some discussions about this with the BEU by the negotiations subcommittee. We're obviously somewhat limited in what we can say in an open session about how those negotiations have developed. But yes, the BEU is aware of this. They've been consulted on it. There have been proposals presented by each side.
And we've gotten full feedback from district staff on comment on it as appropriate.
I'm not sure I would say full, but we do have a lot of staff people who are present for this meeting. And I certainly want to hear from staff about your thoughts on this policy.
Thanks, David.
Go ahead, Tricia.
I like the policy. I think the one thing that I think needs to be made clear is that if you are not vaccinated and you are getting tested, that has to be at the individual's doing it, that the district is not providing that testing. We can provide a list of where places are, but I don't think we can provide that.
Can I join in on that, David?
Okay.
I just wanted to, I could go back and look, but I wanted to just check the language and make sure, if I understood what Dave was saying correctly, and if there's agreement on that, then the option for testing versus vaccination would only be for those with a medical or religious exemption, if I understood correctly. And so I just wanted to see if my understanding is accurate and if that language is reflected in the policy.
So that language is not reflected in the current policy, as that might be something that is subject to negotiation. Similarly to Tricia's point about who pays for testing, that's the type of thing that would be generally subject to negotiation. So the policy is intentionally silent on that matter. And there is a sentence in the policy that talks about in consultation, that implementation of this policy will be in consultation with the BEU. I also provided to subcommittee members, actually the whole school committee, a second draft of this policy, which also added the other union with which we have employees. And there are a couple of other modifications between the first draft and the second draft. Another one that I'd like to point out reflects what Dave Gaishok was telling us about the importance of not just having one test per week, but multiple ones. So the updated draft, it says that employees will need to be tested 3 times a week, and at least one of those 3 tests would need to be the non-rapid test.
Yeah, I did see that. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Valerie?
I have one question and then one comment. The question is on the transportation and food service vendors. Do we know if any of those entities are unionized? So do we require bargaining with those, with any external partners as well? Bus drivers, I'm thinking, are any of them
Yeah, so
subject to negotiation for purposes of this policy?
I'm not sure about the second part of your question, Val, but I can confirm that they are unionized. We don't employ the bus drivers though. So that's one, but food service workers, I think you mentioned custodians. So they are unionized, but I don't know in terms of negotiations of what that looks like.
I was just reading the transportation food service vendors. So I was wondering whether we, working with our vendors, how that would play out vis-a-vis any unionized workforce that they had. And maybe we need to consult on that. And then the comment was just following up on what Jennifer and this David and the other Dave said. I don't think that there's anything that as a policy matter constrains us from amending this to limit it to religious and medical exemptions only. Where we go from there with negotiation is a different matter, but as a policy matter, I don't think that we're constrained necessarily to the current language.
Ellen?
So one thing I'm not sure we can do this, but if we can, it would seem to me that having one of the 3 tests that we're requiring, one of them should be on a Sunday before school starts on Monday. so that people after the weekend don't come in sick on Monday, or positive, find out on Monday afternoon. Better to find out on Sunday and not have them come to school the next day. I assume there's a short turnaround now for these tests. Well, I know there.
All right, so just something else to keep in mind is that a policy is sort of a broad statement of where we stand, and then what emanates from a policy would be the specific procedures to enact it. So I don't know how much detail we want to go into in the policy. We certainly can, but also bear in mind that the district will, at some point soon, provide the more specific procedures as to how this policy will be effectuated.
And maybe Leslie, you could keep that in mind when you're Leslie and Trish, when you're putting together the policy, if it's possible for people to be tested on Sunday so that we don't have people coming on Monday being positive.
Andy?
Yeah, I've got 3 comments here. So one in response to Jennifer regarding negotiations, we do have an executive session that we added before tomorrow night's school committee meeting, where you will get to hear about bargaining history and bargaining obligations before the full committee votes on this policy. So there's that. Second, I agree with Val that the big decision about whether to allow that testing option, like without a medical or religious exemption, that's not something where you necessarily need to worry about bargaining. I think that's a policy decision that we should take like now. And then thirdly, if I would like just to clarify the wording about the which forms of testing are okay. So David, the way you phrased it just now orally, I liked, because in the current draft, I think it says that like at least 2 of the 3, or no more than 2 of the 3 weekly tests can be rapid antigen. I think it'd be better to phrase it as at least 1 of the 3 has to be a molecular test performed in a clinical setting. That last bit, so that it can't just be self-reported as some molecular tests are these days. So like when you do it in a clinical setting, there's actually documentation, from the clinic about the result of the test.
So at least 1 of the 3 weekly negative COVID-19 viral tests must be molecular?
A molecular test performed in a clinical setting.
All right, just made that edit.
But we should get back. We should have a discussion on the big issue of which exemptions to allow. Can people just opt out, and do testing, or are we going to allow that only for medical or religious reasons or others of that nature?
Okay, so do any subcommittee members or school committee members want to opine on that broader question of whether to narrow this to medical and religious exemptions versus it being a choice? Susan?
So I'm not a member of the policy subcommittee. I want to let everyone else talk first, but first of all, I'm glad we're fast tracking this conversation. I think it's a really important one. The question that I was asked, and I thought I knew the answer, I just want to confirm it, is whether or not there are other mandates, other vaccine mandates that staff are under. So students, obviously, that has been, has changed a little bit over the years. But the question was, is this going to be the first vaccine mandate for staff in Brookline? So I think that would be helpful to just get everyone on the same page about.
I don't think HR has ever, I don't know if they ask for anything immunization wise, but I know that most staff have not. We have a lot of staff who've been here a long time, so I don't think most staff have ever supplied any immunization information. There have been times during a school year where there's some contagion at a school and staff who cannot supply their vaccination status have to stay home until they either get vaccinated or can prove their immunity with various things that we've seen in the community in the past, but that's the extent of requirements that I'm aware of. And I think it's always frustrated me a little bit that we don't have that, so.
And obviously they change in terms of, shingles, in terms of Tdap versus TD, and like the guidance does change over time. And so I think it would just be helpful we need to do this now, and I think we need to fast track this, but I do think that it's sort of worth the broader conversation as well about how we think about vaccine mandates for adults, for staff.
All right, any other thoughts from subcommittee or school committee members as to the question of whether to narrow the exemptions to medical or religious? Suzanne?
Yeah, I believe other communities have just those two exemptions. So I think that's pretty common. So I would be comfortable with doing that. I think Newton did that, but I believe other communities are doing that as well as perhaps the state. I'm not exactly sure, but it seems to me most of those that I've been reading have those two exemptions.
Okay, Valerie?
Only support only the legally mandatory exemptions, so religious and ADA.
Andy?
I think we should just recognize that if we only have the legally mandated exemptions, then we may lose a substantial number of staff in the middle of the year. I think Matt Gillis has expressed some concern about this. So, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do that, but I think we should keep that in mind.
That is the main reason why I drafted it as a choice, because there have been some admonitions from Matt Gillis about potential ramifications on personnel and what we do if we suddenly have a staffing shortage. So to that point, do we have any idea of how, at this point, of how many of what percentage of our staff is vaccinated?
I even spoke to Matt about it recently, and he said he actually doesn't know. I mean, he's just speculating. He didn't really know what those numbers might look like. He wasn't even sure we'd lose anybody. I mean, he's just a Matt. He said he was just, again, speculating. So I don't know what that would be.
Okay. So it sounds like the majority sentiment is to limit the exemptions to medical and religious. So I think we can go ahead and put that in. So let me find a place to slot that. All right, so in the first paragraph, particularly due to the inability of many students to obtain vaccinations until they are age eligible in the setting of schools where groups gather indoors, the public schools of Brookline, consistent with public health guidance and the governor's executive orders, shall require all staff to, I'll delete the word either, to demonstrate that they have received full COVID-19 vaccination and maintain full vaccination as a condition of employment unless they receive a medical or a documented medical or religious exemption from a doctor or clergy.
Can I just try to wordsmith with you, David? I would just say in accordance with state and federal law.
Okay.
Leave the rest to
receive a document.
Leave the rest to implementation. Yeah.
Or a religious exemption in accordance with state and federal law. Is what you're saying, Valerie?
Yes, with relevant state and or federal law.
Relevant state and or federal law. Period.
I might use the word provide instead of receive, but they provide.
Okay, that they provide.
Trish, while he's wordsmithing, were the teachers required to get flu vaccines last year or the year before when when there was the requirement for students?
No, students were required, and then at some point they rescinded that requirement, but it was never for staff.
Huh.
All right, so shall require all staff to provide proof that they have received full COVID-19 vaccination and maintain full vaccination as a condition of employment unless they receive a documented medical or religious exemption in accordance with relevant state and or federal law. In the event that such an exemption is approved, and then just the rest of it, continuing proof of 3 weekly negative COVID-19 viral test results, let's see, approved. Exempted staff shall provide continuing proof of 3 weekly negative COVID-19 viral test results to the Office of the Coordinator of School Health Services or entities designated by the Office of the Coordinator of School Health Services every school week as a condition of employment. At least one of the 3 weekly negative COVID-19 viral tests must be a molecular test performed in a clinical setting. I don't think we can say negative because it might be that someone tests positive, so I'll take that out. All right, so just to read the second half of that paragraph again, so that we're all clear. Particularly due to the inability of many students to obtain vaccination until they are age eligible and the setting of schools where groups gather indoors, the public schools of Brookline, consistent with public health guidance and the governor's executive orders, shall require all staff to provide proof that they have received full COVID-19 vaccination and maintain full vaccination as a condition of employment, unless they receive a documented medical or religious exemption in accordance with relevant state and or federal law. In the event that such an exemption is approved, exempted staff shall provide continuing proof of 3 weekly negative COVID-19 viral test results to the Office of the Coordinator of School Health Services or entities designated by the Office of the Coordinator of School Health Services every school week as a condition of employment. At least one of the 3 weekly COVID-19 viral tests must be a molecular test performed in a clinical setting. And then the rest of it can.
Are the tests at CVS molecular?
It depends. It depends.
Because if they are.
Some of them are, some aren't.
Okay, but if it's a medical a clinical setting, I don't think, is CVS considered a clinical setting?
CVS Health would be where you go in and get swabbed by a practitioner
Okay,
there, and then, but not an off-the-shelf product.
Okay.
Yeah, they also have drive-throughs. Some of the drive-throughs are PCR molecular, some of them are not. You really have to check. Like it says so on the checklist on the website.
Okay.
Dave, I see you've got your virtual hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks, David. Just wanted to throw out 2 other things in light of the direction the subcommittee is going. It may make sense to have a grace period with testing support to allow people to get to that point. We would recommend, as per my comments earlier, that testing start immediately, even if, to the extent folks are not currently vaccinated, with some time to get there. And I was remiss in saying before, and I should have expressed the minority viewpoint that I alluded to on the panel, which was less supportive of mandated vaccination. I want to make clear, still supportive of vaccination, but worried about pressure, stigma, et cetera, of folks feeling excluded who have legitimate concerns and otherwise. And so anything that PSB can do and that we can help support PSB in doing and helping people along rather than making this a draconian pronouncement for folks we want to do. And that's important to keep, folks feeling like they're part of the same team.
Valerie?
Just for clarification, when you say molecular, Andy, do you mean PCR?
Any of the nucleic acid amplification tests, which in most cases does mean PCR. I think that I'm not an expert on the different kinds of nucleic acid tests, but there's some that are called by other
Okay.
names. So,
I just didn't know if we wanted to call it out for clarity purposes, but if
I will
we're
mention-
yeah, I think one of the bullets lists kind of what we mean by molecular, right?
Right, to that point, Valerie,
definition 3, right?
yes. The third definition spells it out. Okay, so where does anyone recommend where to insert the line about testing begins immediately?
Maybe after you talk about why it's important to be vaccinated, and safety of students and other staff, maybe at that point, talk about why the need for the testing to begin immediately if a person is not vaccinated.
Right.
My connection was a little bit unstable, so I'm not sure if you said this, but are you changing the date by which we're requiring the
So I don't think we
vaccine?
can, I don't think we should change the date of when proof of the vaccine, a deadline for when proof of the vaccine needs to be provided, because if someone is just going to decide to get vaccinated now, they're going to need about an 8-week period. So that puts us close to November 1st, but there obviously would be nothing that stops staff from providing proof of vaccination if they've already been vaccinated right away. And that would allow them to opt out of testing up until that point. So I think the question is more, where do we put in the line about immediate testing? Valerie?
So I would suggest the sentence that begins, staff who cannot demonstrate full vaccination by November 1st. B, cannot demonstrate full vaccination by the date of implementation of this policy. So if it's tomorrow, then tomorrow. Must submit their first weekly test by blah, blah, blah. We could also include or who has met the criteria for a religious or medical exemption. Maybe break it up into 2 sentences there, but I would put it there where we're putting the timelines in for providing documentation now. That grace period for people who are going to get vaccinated but need until November 1st, and then for the exempt individuals. But that seems like the logical place given the way it's drafted currently, to me.
All right, so staff who cannot demonstrate full vaccination by the date of implementation of this policy must submit their first weekly COVID-19 viral test result by the first Monday after policy implementation and every school week thereafter. I'm not sure that we would need to mention the exempted personnel because they would be providing, well, in terms of when they first do it, yes, so I guess we do. Staff who cannot demonstrate full vaccination or qualified or approved exempt status. Or approved exempt status by the date of implementation of this policy must submit their first weekly. Well, again, if the approved exempt status people are going to need to submit to testing anyway, then wouldn't we want them to start that now rather than November 1st? So therefore, I don't think we need to include that portion of it. Okay, so that That sentence now reads, staff who cannot demonstrate full vaccination by the date of implementation of this policy must submit their first weekly COVID-19 viral test result by the first Monday after policy implementation and every school week thereafter. Does anyone else have thoughts on this draft? No, do we think it's ready to go? All right, does someone want to move it for referral to the full school committee? Thank you, Andy. Is there a second? Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer, your vote? Jennifer, your vote on referral?
Yes, I'm sorry. Could you guys not hear me? I apologize. Yes.
I hear you. Valerie?
Yes.
Andy?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. All right, so
David,
thank you,
maybe-
everyone.
I'm sorry this is so late. I noticed that there's a hand up among the attendees.
Okay.
I guess we've already taken a vote, but.
Excuse me, David, that's Ann Braga, who's the town HR director.
Okay. Robin, can you promote Ann Braga and let her join us?
Certainly.
Good evening, all. I'm Ann Braga. I'm the town HR director. As you may or may not know, the town conducted an anonymous survey regarding vaccination status for both town and school employees. And I wanted to share the results that we have. Out of the 704 respondents from the public schools of Brookline, 694 or 98.6% reported that they were fully vaccinated. Some including their boosters as appropriate. 8 indicated they were not vaccinated. There was 1 in the partially vaccinated status, and then 2 other responses that didn't meet any of those criteria. So 98.6% out of 704 employees is what you're looking at least for anonymized responses. Obviously, we don't have like their vaccine card as part of this. We just asked them to identify their department and what vaccination status they were in. So I wanted to provide that information to you. I know being an attendee, it's hard to sort of see hands raised, but I wanted you to have that information just for your consideration as well.
Andy, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Ann. That's actually really important information. Do you have a sense of, did the survey include, for example, custodial workers, or was it limited to like?
It included all employees, regardless of the either union or role that they had. So some people identified as just Brookline Public Schools, some identified as Brookline Public Schools athletic or custodial. We did not go down to the location level. We didn't want to make it, we wanted to make it as anonymous as we could, but a way to define it either within departments on the town side or just Brookline Public Schools on the other. We were looking for as many respondents as we could get. So that was why we did it as broadly as we did.
Susan?
Thank you, Anne, for doing this. How many people did it go out to who are PSB employees? There's was it all full time? Was it all employees?
It went to all employees. That was handled through the HR and administration and finance office on the school side. We gave them the link for folks. It was basically a link or a QR code. So it was as simple as it could be for folks who are less technology challenged or more technology challenged.
No, that's helpful. I mean, there are numbers as high as the 1400s, you know, in terms of PSB staff, depending on how you count and who it went to. So if we have a 50% response rate, that's really different from other kinds of response rates. Presumably the people who are vaccinated would, I don't know, just I'm mindful of sample bias in terms of who's likely to respond. So if we had half the people responding and 98% of them were fully vaccinated, I'm just not sure what that tells us about the other half, if that makes sense. So I definitely appreciate that. I think it might be helpful if someone, I'm not sure who, can talk to on our administration and finance side, figure out how many people that, what the N was, how many people that went to, so we can make a determination about that.
Because it went through our Code Red system and the school side equivalent of that, I'll be in contact with those folks during this meeting. If I get an answer, I will either stick my hand up or text or email Robin to let you know.
Great, fantastic, thank you.
Lynn?
Could you share the town side response?
It was about 180 employees on the town side that responded. I'm just looking for, where's my data? We had 158 responses. I don't have the exact numbers on who's fully vaccinated, but I see maybe 4 people that have listed as not vaccinated. The rest are fully vaccinated. Obviously from Public Works, which is our driving population in our labor service AFSCME folks, we don't have a huge number of responses from there. Police and fire, we don't have, but we know that anywhere between 80 to 85% or higher actually participated in the town-sponsored vaccine clinics for first responders, because we're able to get additional vaccine for those folks. And so, and the informal survey that was done at libraries, I believe all but like 5 people are vaccinated.
Thank you.
Out of their total N.
All right, any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Braga, for providing us with that information.
You're welcome.
And we can now move on to the next agenda item, which is a discussion of a possible school committee statement. Oh, sorry, Dave, you had something you wanted to say?
Nope, just waving. Bye, guys. Good luck with the next agenda item.
All right, thank you. All right, so our next agenda item is a possible vote on a school committee statement on learning for absent students that are in COVID-19 protocols. There are a couple different versions for us to consider. So there's one version that all of you received over the weekend. And then there is another version that was sent out this morning that included staff edits. So does anyone have some initial thoughts about these two versions or anything at all pertaining to this topic to start off? Jennifer, go ahead.
I didn't see anybody raising their hand, so I figured I'd jump in. I actually liked some of the edits that the school district, the one that we, most recent version that we got. I thought there were some things that really made sense as far as what we could deliver reasonably for students who might need to be out of school. So I liked some of those edits. That's pretty, I mean, I don't really know. I don't know. I'd love to hear what other people have to say. That version looked okay to me, unless people have reasons that they like the first version better.
Andy?
Yeah, so there's some wording in the edits in the second bullet point about remote learning may be offered to students as deemed appropriate by the educator in collaboration with the family and as negotiated by the school committee and the Brookline Educators Union. So does this mean that the school committee is being asked to open negotiations with the BEU over this? Because that hasn't happened up to now, and this is in fact the first I've heard of it, so.
I can jump in, Andy. So my thinking was that, in the original document, it stated really clearly that the school committee's intention was for educators to bring students who are quarantined into the classroom virtually. And it seemed to me that that was something that would need to be negotiated. I could be wrong about that, so I will defer to others. But that was some of the reasoning for the language. I think, also just the vein of thinking around the edits were that, I'm really cognizant that our educators have not had the experience of teaching a full class of children in front of them while also having children log in virtually. And I really would like to hear from educators around, I don't want to overpromise anything, so I'd love to hear, what their thinking is, once they've had a full class of children in front of them for a period of time, because what I would hate to see is us or the school committee take a position that then is very difficult for educators to implement. And I do think that there are a number of strategies and things we can put in place, like consistent use of the LMS. I'm truly hoping that we don't have as many children quarantining just because of mitigation strategies and test and stay. But for those ones that are quarantining, really thinking about what makes sense for that child, depending on what grade level they're in. Where they are in terms of the work. I think there's just a number of factors that should be discussed and considered between the educator, the school leader, and the family.
So I wonder if so given what you just said, Leslie, would it be better to word it as, like these practices will be sort of developed by PSB sort of in consultation with the BEU, as opposed to the current wording, which pretty much implies that we're going to have negotiations, and that may or may not be the case.
Sure, fair enough. That's fair, Andy.
All right. So as a subcommittee, do we want to be working off of the staff edited version? It looks like a yes from Andy. Jennifer, okay, so we'll go to that one. So I'll make that suggested modification from Andy. So in the second, in what's listed as point number 2, offer to students who have tested positive for COVID-19 as deemed appropriate by the educator in collaboration with the family and in consultation with the Brookline Educators Union. Now there's something earlier in that sentence that I'm a little concerned about, which is at the discretion of the educator or as deemed appropriate by the educator. Not that I think our educators wouldn't make proper decisions, but the way that's phrased, it currently leaves everything wide open to that particular educator as to whether the student would have access. So I think that's a little too loose. Does anyone else have thoughts on that? Jennifer?
Sorry, so you're talking in that same number 2, item number 2. I'm sorry, I'm home. I don't like Zoom. I apologize for the dog. Although DESE no longer allows public school districts to offer remote learning as a primary option, remote learning may be offered as deemed appropriate by the educator. Is that maybe, and someone in the district might know better, is that maybe a principal decision? Is that about whether or not a child, I don't know where that decision, I understand what you're saying. It's not how, it's the who gets to. That's what you're saying, David, right? Who gets to get this remote option. So it's really like,
I'm a little concerned that if we're leaving it up to an unnamed educator, it might not happen. I want to assume the best of intentions, but there may be times where a student would be denied access just based on one person's opinion, and it's not really clear who that person would be and how that decision would be made.
Is it referenced to, I guess, maybe we can reference it back to the first intro paragraph there where it says that we are committed to offering any students absent due to medically documented COVID-19 concerns or quarantine protocols. So is the intention that anyone who falls in that category would have access in some shape or form to resources for learning at home? Is that what you're getting at? I guess I'm trying to understand, is it who makes the decision about who gets the remote piece or how it gets delivered?
I guess more how it gets delivered. I want to make sure that all of our students would truly have access and that one person is not going to be able to make the determination of what would be appropriate, especially if what would be appropriate might mean just doing homework and not really participating. Because if they don't participate for at least half a day, they're not marked as present. And that's a big problem. So I'm just worried about the loophole that potentially creates.
I understand what you're saying now. You're okay.
David, I wonder if we can add something there about by the educator and principal in collaboration with the family, period. The sentence that we added, and I'm not looking at your working draft, so I don't see your live changes, but the piece about in consultation with the Brookline Educators Union, I see those as two separate things. One is a real-time decision that needs to be made with the family, the principal, and the classroom teacher, quite frankly, and any other service providers as part of that student's educational team. They need to make the decision of, once a student has been exposed, we know that the student will be out for X number of days. What can the student reasonably be up for? Right. So that's one decision. And then I think that in consultation with the BEU is a whole other process. I think I'm seeing those as two separate things. Unless, Andy, you were thinking something different when you made that suggestion.
No, I think I see it more or less as you've been saying. In fact, to my mind, I'm not sure we even, thinking about it more, we don't even necessarily need to say in consultation with the BEU. I mean, it goes without saying that we will fulfill any bargaining obligations that arise, based on whatever procedures PSB wants to put in place. So I'm not sure that actually needs to be spelled out in the policy.
Yep.
And I guess this isn't a policy, but it's a statement of, a statement.
Right, we should keep that in mind. This is not an
Yeah.
actual policy. This is just a school committee statement about what our intention is for students who are absent due to COVID-19 related concerns. So I agree with Andy. I don't think we need to mention the union here. If this were a policy, that might be a different matter, but it's just a school committee statement. So I'm going to go ahead and go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, I'm sort of struggling a little bit with this conversation to square it with other conversations we've had about what it is that we want to be able to do. And it seems to me that if in the first instance, our goal is for students to not be penalized in any way if they are staying home because they are symptomatic or because they are, have COVID or they're, for whatever reason, public health reason that they need to be staying home. I guess what I'm wondering is how do we avoid a situation where, let's say one 6th grade teacher says, it's all on LMS, it's all asynchronous for those 3 days, kind of go figure it out. And and that child is marked absent, and another 6th grade student is zoomed into the classroom and is watching all their classes synchronously, even if they're not, fully participating. Because Leslie, I completely take your point about, it can't be, that's a lot going on. But another student who's in 6th grade for 3 days gets marked present for those 3 days because that was at the discretion of the educator. So I want to make sure that we're not setting up an inequitable situation. And I want to make sure that for sure the LMS being up to date has to be table stakes and has to be consistent. So Leslie, I totally support whatever, just support you on that and anything we can do to make that consistent. I guess I just want to make sure we're not setting up, kind of adverse situations in any way, so that we're going to get sort of a consistent and equitable experience for kids. So I don't know if anyone else is worried about that, but and I think it probably depends by grade level, because I think 6 through 8 is very different from high school, which is very different from, K through 2, 3 through 5. Like each of the grade bands has a really different day, a different way of interacting with technology. And so I think 6 through 12 is probably one set of circumstances. And I think the lower grades might be a little bit different, but I guess I just worry about consistency.
Well, Susan, to that point, I think Casey's proposed edit of adding educator and principal is helpful, because I think the principal would have more of that equitable lens. Valerie, go ahead. You're on mute. There you go.
So I agree with Susan in terms of equity on the education front, but also I think we need to be consistent with our statement in the first paragraph. In that specific paragraph, it seems to mention only those who are diagnosed with COVID-19 and not others who maybe are medically vulnerable and living with someone who's tested positive, or other situations where we want to encourage someone to stay home or where they need to stay home for public health reasons, but are not themselves positive, to make sure that that piece of equity is also, and that public health measure is also encouraged.
Andy?
Okay, yeah, I guess to maybe to go back to part of Susan's point, which seemed to be like part of the reason we want to do something along these lines is to avoid having to mark people absent. If when they're doing something that is actually something we want them to do. So do we have a clear idea of like how much needs to happen on a given day, according to DESE, for a child to not be marked absent? Like, are we even providing the kinds of activities that would allow somebody to not be marked absent if they participate?
So DESE essentially defines it as a half day of instruction. What qualifies as instruction is fairly loose, but it needs to be directed instruction in a half day.
But it doesn't need to be synchronous instruction or whatever the terms were from last year. Like, can we assign enough work to fill half a day and consider them to have attended? Or does it need to be sort of actual live interaction, or what are the standards here?
You know what, that's a great question, Andy. I assumed it was a mix just based on what the guidance was last year. But let me ask and be specific, get some specifics around that, if it means a half day of virtual directed instruction. Again, I just, based on what happened last year, I made that assumption. So, but I will find out the specifics. So I do think it's a different conversation if it can be a mix of, asynchronous included, especially for our little people who, we would not, I don't think it's developmentally appropriate to keep them on a Zoom for 3 hours.
Jennifer?
So I think that it's important that it's equitable and consistent, but I'm also just sort of trying to balance that with, it's a statement. We're not even drafting a policy. And so some of this sounds that it's somewhat procedural, that the district should figure out a system for equitable access. So we're making a school committee statement, but I don't know that we need to detail all of this in this particular statement. Unless the language is, that we're interested in an equitable and consistent, access to whatever. And, but it seems to me that perhaps, and this is something we talk a lot about, the difference between policy and procedures. I'm just not sure how far our statement should go or can go.
All right, anyone else?
Sorry, can I just add on? I think it's just going to be really challenging to be much more specific than saying we want it to be equitable and consistent, only in that there is such variety between what a high schooler can do and what a kindergartner or first grader can do. I don't know how that could be sort of laid out unless someone has language to propose. I think there is some level of inherent need for flexibility in this situation.
Well, I think the equity piece of it is going to, of course, be mindful of the grade level of the student. But the idea is more that if you're dealing with 2 third graders, both third graders are going to have access to instruction for a half day so they can be marked present. We'll try to find out further what will qualify as a half day of instruction. And 2 similarly situated 8th graders would have the same type of access. It's equity in that sense, not that a third grader would have the same access as a 12th grader. Obviously, they're in different positions.
I hear you. Is it your thought that we should have something like that in this statement, that it should be that specific? And I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out, like where are we heading in order to land on a statement? What are you intending for that language to be in this statement? The specifics.
I don't think we have to specifically mention equity, but we want to make sure that our statement covers equitable principles. So I'm more comfortable with Casey's suggested edit that I've already put in about it being at the approval deemed appropriate by the educator and principal, because I do trust a principal in overseeing her or his school building, that there will be equity in mind about how to treat similarly situated students. I do think that adds possibly a sufficient measure of protection. I do want us, though, to pay careful attention to what Valerie raised about there being coherence between the first paragraph about those who decide to stay home because they're experiencing COVID-like symptoms but don't necessarily have a positive test, as well as those who tested negative but are close contacts and have to be in quarantine anyway, or those who are awaiting results, because those categories of students are not currently covered by point number 2.
That sounds like a reasonable, to match the language, that seems reasonable to me.
Leslie?
So I think 2 things. I think one, our thinking was just around the support that the Test and Stay program would provide, that there wouldn't be many children out because they're close contacts because of Test and Stay. So that's going to be a difference from last year to this year. Then, just thinking about the wordsmithing of it and just putting my principal hat back on, I am a little hesitant to put the onus on a principal, because you're going to get variety amongst schools, and it puts I don't know. I feel like, I don't know. I am just cognizant of the language, the educator and the principal. I'm not sure if that's the right language, but I can be swayed, but I'm just thinking through that.
David, can I?
Go ahead, Susan.
No, Leslie, I completely agree with you. And I think that as you think about the different, maybe going back to grade bands is the way to do it, so that, the senior leadership team, the principals and your office together, in Casey's crew together, can kind of come up with what expectations would be at a middle school level. And just to say that I think that you're right, that there can be variety across principals as well, and a lot of pressure put on principals. And we don't want that. We don't want to take away their discretion, but we also don't want to put that pressure on them unnecessarily. So I would feel comfortable if we said, if we made statements about how we expect kids to be in school learning. If there's a medical reason for them not to, we really, really do not want them to be in school. We want them to take that seriously and not feel pressured. We don't want to create, disincentives to doing the right thing from a public health perspective. But what that means is going to differ by grade level. And so since this is sort of a school committee level set of expectations and more setting expectations, then I think I would feel very comfortable turning it back to, Office of Teaching and Learning, Office of Student Services, and the principals to come up with their recommendations for how to, do this across at the high school, middle school, and elementary level, because I think you're right. It really will differ in terms of how much time a student can spend on Zoom, what's appropriate. Again, 6 through 8, just very different from, from high school, or from, actually 6 through 8 might be closer to high school, but very different from K-5. And so I think I'd be really interested to hear what the principals and your central office and the teachers think is the right answer to accelerate, keep education going while keeping kids, who need to be at home, who we do not want in the buildings there, so they don't feel penalized. I mean, again, certainly at the high school level, if you can imagine, if you miss 3 days of an AP class, you've missed a world war, and they've kind of kept going. And so it's actually a really big deal to miss 3 days, in some of our classes, whereas other places, other things are going on. So I would trust our educators to come up with some, consistency district-wide to deal with exactly what David was saying about just making sure we don't have radically different experiences across 8th grades or something like that.
Sorry, go ahead, Jennifer.
Oh, no, I was just saying I couldn't hear you. I'm all out of comments. Although I do think that, now that I have the floor, I do think that it could be helpful for the district to come up with some sort of parameters or guideline by grade bands. That could be a guiding piece of paper, just to make things easier for principals, for educators, for parents to sort of understand what can people expect. But I don't know how specific that even could get, but I mean, I see that there could be value in that. I don't know what kind of turnaround time or how much work in the middle of opening school people have for that. Leslie, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's certainly something that we can pose. We're meeting with school leaders on the 15th. And so I can talk to Dr. Guillory about this being one of our agenda items. Well, we have a principals meeting. I don't know if I said, well, principals are coming to meet with central office staff for a half day on the 15th. So that would be a good time just to talk about it collectively. We have had some initial discussions with principals, but, rightfully so, they were really just, their head was in the game about getting students back into the building safely and making sure that educators felt supported and ready to go. So I think they might be in a different place now where we can really move the conversation forward. Additionally, they will have had some days under their belt of having a school full of children. And so that's going to be a little bit different. And so, I think it'll be a good time to have the conversation.
Suzanne? Go ahead, Suzanne.
Oh, okay, thanks. So I'm really struggling with this on many levels. I have no idea if we're talking about every classroom will have one child absent because of this, like once a month, every day. So I have no idea what the scope of this is, which is really making it hard for me to understand what it is we're going to try to provide. And then we get into this talk about, are owls, cameras going to be available to teachers? Which teachers get them? Which kids plug into that? I mean, so, our statement is that we want the kids to have access to learning while they're out, and particularly if they're just quarantined. We hope, as you said, Leslie, that won't be very many people or many students. But there's just a lot of questions about the implementation of this that I have. And I think Casey and Leslie and Michelle can get to it. But this statement in my mind is more about this is what we want. It's not, again, about how it's going to happen, because I don't see it happening right now, even though I know kids are going to start to be absent soon. But there are a lot of questions about this. And I don't want to promise more than we can deliver to the public. On the other hand, I don't want to look like we don't care and we're not concerned. So there's that fine line. And so that's just what I'm struggling with right now. So I don't have answers. I just have kind of questions and concerns. Yeah.
So at least the way I look at this, I see this as aspirational, as a school committee taking a position that we profoundly care about ensuring that our students have access to an education as much as possible, and that we don't want to penalize students who stay home because they are being responsible and not putting their peers and their educators at risk for transmission of COVID-19, because we would, in effect, be discouraging honesty if we don't at least make a commitment, even if we can't implement it right away, if we don't at least make a commitment to providing that educational access. The way this is currently written, and again, this is by making modifications from the staff edited draft, I don't think that we are being super specific about how the education will be delivered. We're just saying that something is going to occur. There will be instruction, there will be opportunities. And ultimately, it will be up to the district to determine how those opportunities will be provided. So to me, I'm fully comfortable moving forward with this along those lines. Any other thoughts?
I guess I'll just jump in and say, David, I have a lot of confidence in our educators that they'll be able to get this done. And it really, that is one of their basic job responsibilities, right? Is that when a child is out, that the child will be brought up to speed and, they will receive what they've missed. And so one of the things that I think we've learned through the course of the pandemic is that there's a lot of ways to engage children, in addition to virtually streaming into classrooms. I know we got a lot of positive educator feedback and parent feedback about the pre-recorded Lucy Calkins videos that were shared with students. There have been some other platforms, not for LMS, but just other venues that teachers have used. And I'd like to, learn a little bit more about that and then figure out what makes sense to continue to explore and to implement. So I have a lot of confidence that we can do this. And again, like Susan said, I think it's different depending on grade level. But I also think there's a lot of venues that we can pull from in terms of, pre-recorded lessons, virtual access to the classroom, the LMS, a number of things. So I feel good about that.
I was just going to say, remember, our educators spent a lot of time and energy last year developing things for online learning that we can certainly use again. I'm sure that there are resources that have been developed that can be used to provide instruction to students. So I'm also feeling really confident that our educators will be able to figure this out, and with the support of the Office of Teaching and Learning and Student Services.
Anyone else?
David,
Right, so,
could you just read number 2? I've lost track of where we are with that.
okay, so the only changes that have been made to the draft that was distributed late this morning, that was edited by staff, the only changes that have been made have been to number 2. So here's how number 2 now reads. Although the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE, no longer allows public school districts to offer remote learning as a primary option, remote learning may be offered to students experiencing potential symptoms of COVID-19 as they await COVID-19 viral test results, quarantining students who may have been exposed to a person testing positive for COVID-19, and students who have tested positive for COVID-19, as deemed appropriate by the educator and principal. This could include access to virtual teaching, such as audio from live stream classes and/or pre-recorded lessons by the classroom teacher or curated digital resources. Per DESE, students in quarantine who participate remotely for at least half a day may be marked present. I think we can take out the qualification students in quarantine. It's students who participate remotely for a half day may be marked present. So I'm going to remove the in quarantine. Andy?
David, I worry a little bit about having that last sentence in there if we don't yet know what it is that DESE counts as being present, or, because we're not necessarily committing to providing the level of interaction or instruction that would satisfy that requirement, right? Maybe things will be great and we will be able to do that, but I don't hear that commitment yet, right? We may not be able to. So I worry that having that sentence in there is promising more than we can actually deliver in the end.
Well, it is true that at least a half day of instruction does count for being marked as present. So that's not really at issue. What's at issue is what qualifies as the half day.
Right, and if we are unable to actually supply enough instruction, to meet that, then, having that in there, makes it seem like we've fallen short of something that we undertook to do.
No, I'm not sure I'm comfortable taking that out because we want to offer reassurance that at least our aspiration is to create the ability for students who are out for COVID-19 related reasons that they could still potentially be marked as present if they are satisfying the DESE requirements. So I certainly agree.
Do you think you could phrase it that way then, that like, to make it clear that this is our aspiration, that we hope to provide a level, but we want to offer enough so that if you participate for half the day, then you'll be marked present.
All right, we could do that. What do other members think? Should we soften the DESE language? That is something we want, but go ahead, Jennifer.
I don't know, I'm just struggling. The half day of instruction, like, there's sort of two pieces, and I don't know that anybody's really brought it up or we want to get into this, but we can provide the instruction, but what if students don't engage in that work? Like that is a real thing. So how does that work? So our language should reflect that. There are instances where children may not complete the work, whether it's for many reasons, some very valid, maybe they are too ill to do that work, in which case they would be absent and not have that work. And then sometimes circumstances that for many different reasons, family reasons, they do not complete the work. And so how does that work? So I get really nervous when we talk about making a statement, a commitment to not marking students absent, just because there can be examples where students aren't necessarily having the opportunity or not engaging with work. I don't know how else to say that. Maybe someone can do a better job, but I'm nervous about that, the commitment. And so I think we have to say it's an aspiration or that we want to be able to do things, or it's the intention, maybe something about students completing the work. And even if it is if it's a mix of synchronous and asynchronous, or maybe it's all asynchronous, there has to be sort of a level of engagement with that work in order to count as a day.
So how about this? The way I had it in the initial draft was the school committee anticipates that students receiving such organized instruction from outside the school building will be marked present, consistent with Department of Elementary and Secondary Education attendance regulations. When phrased that way, whatever they are, we're just saying that we're going to be consistent with them. So I would think that would take care of it.
David, what was the first part of that sentence that had the word organized in it?
The school committee anticipates that students receiving such organized instruction from outside the school building will be marked present. Take out organized, just such instruction.
Yeah. I'm wary of the word organized, and it's by whom, and again, we get back to that equity piece from school to school or classroom to classroom. And I don't want to forget Leslie's comment about adding, I know that was my suggestion to add principal to it, but it doesn't sound like adding that. I want to make sure that we're sensitive to, again, ensuring that there are equitable practices across schools, across classrooms. And I'm not sure by adding principal ensures that.
Okay, so instead of principal and the deputy superintendent of teaching and learning.
Yeah, I mean, I think Susan, now I can't remember exactly what it was that Susan said when she laid out sort of the, like, I think she was like, 1,000 foot above that in terms of a statement saying, here's what we as the school committee endeavor to do, here's what we are aiming to do, and then we will have this group of folks or this level of folks determine the process by which we would review educational programming for students who are out for COVID-related reasons. Because again, to Suzanne's point, I don't want to make a decision here today that will have implications in the classroom that we can't actually follow through with.
And I do think we'll be able to get more into the weeds with this when we talk to principals about it.
So how about taking out the "and" principle and just put "in an equitable manner"? As deemed appropriate by the educator in an equitable manner? No. All right. Susan, do you have some proposed language?
Yeah, I proposed a brilliant thing that Casey thinks I said 5 minutes ago. Whatever that thing was, I proposed that. I think that to the extent that this is a statement of expectation, then what we can say is that that it's not so much that it's decided by the educator in an equitable manner, it's that we as the school committee are setting an expectation, and it's the, if anything, it's the superintendent's office and the principals in conjunction, that are coming back to us with an equitable, with a recommendation on how they're going to do this in an equitable way. Mindful of, and maybe that's where we just say mindful of differences by, grade span, by special needs status and language status and other things. And we can put in there that we're mindful of those differences and that we still expect equitable education for kids. And that that's what we want them to come back with, is that approach.
Yeah. So you had it, Susan. Thank you.
Can I just, David, I know you're typing.
Go ahead.
It seems like we're going a little bit back toward the original draft, quite frankly, as a policy statement. So I'm wondering whether we want to pull some of the language. I don't know that we have in this, I've lost track of where we are with this version. But it said, the variety of platforms and things like that to the greatest extent possible and pedagogically practicable. So to me, that's essentially what we're trying to say with a lot of other words that was in the original draft. So I'm not sure if people are comfortable with that and utilizing that with that equity lens as language in there. I think it's from the second to last sentence.
Yes, it might actually, I agree with you, Valerie. It might be easier at this point to work off the first one since we're changing the second one so much. Maybe instead of, so the line about, let's see, although the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education no longer allows public school districts to offer remote learning as a primary option, the school committees committed offering any students absent due to medically documented COVID-19 concerns or quarantine protocols the ability to access, instead of their classrooms, to access instruction, so that we're not as literal about being in the classroom, and soften it that way, to access instruction remotely via Zoom or other technological platforms. Then I could include such as, and then list from the second version, LMS, let's see, put in that language, such as learning management systems, and put in point number 1, essentially.
And I would change instruction to learning, David.
Okay.
That's my records.
To access learning remotely via Zoom or other technological platforms such as learning management systems, pre-K2 Seesaw, 3.5 Google Classroom, grade 6-12 Canvas, that will allow educators to share assignments, materials, and provide a platform for streamlined communication between educators, students, and families to the greatest extent possible and pedagogically practicable. The school committee further expects that any students receiving such, I'll take out organized, such instruction from outside the school building will be marked present, consistent with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education attendance regulations. The school committee appreciates the ongoing efforts of our staff, administrators, educators, parents, guardians, and volunteers to keep our students connected. I think that covers the points we want to say, so maybe just go with that. Thank you for that suggestion, Valerie. All right, so does everyone have that? Andy?
I guess to come back to a point I tried to raise earlier, I think that sentence about being marked present per DESE, like that is committing us to offering a level of instruction that will allow students to be marked present according to whatever the regulation is, and we're not completely sure what it is, it seems. Like, are we really committed to being able to do that? Like, what if it turns out to be like you have to have synchronous instruction, you know, for more or less that whole time for it to count? Like, we may not be in a position to offer that, right? I feel like it's offering a hostage to fortune to have that language in there. We cannot guarantee right now that we're going to be able to meet that standard.
I think, Andy, unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me, David, you might, but the DESE language, I think, says something about this is only if districts have the ability to allow the student to follow their schedule throughout the day.
Do you want me to read it? Casey, I have it. Do you
Yeah.
want me to read it?
Okay, yeah, please, because
Okay.
I don't think that's something we can commit to.
Yeah, no, so the question is, so it's in a Q&A. What they've documented this in a Q&A at the end of August. It says, can students who are quarantining due to a COVID-19 related issue participate in remote learning? And then it says, during the 21-22 school year, full-time remote learning programs will not count towards structured learning time hours unless specifically authorized by DESE. And then it says, consistent with DESE's guidance on student attendance, quarantining students who do participate in at least half of the school day activities can be marked present. So it's school day activities. It doesn't say instruction. It doesn't say learning. It says school day activities, at least half. And then it says, if schools are not able to allow students to join their schedule remotely, schools should adopt a policy consistent with other absences and provide work for students that can be completed at home. To minimize the amount of time required to quarantine outside of school districts, outside of school, districts should adopt the test and stay program, which we're doing. So that's their Q&A language from late August. Their kind of official guidance.
Well, if the critical word, if the pivotal word here is activities, I think we can do that. It's not saying that it has to be live, it's just saying activities.
So that was why I thought that it could be a mix of activities, was that it would be some direct instruction, but also the student's ability to complete the work that's assigned, that would be assigned during that period or that, the school day. But again, I'll look into it. I'm looking just at a listserv of assistant superintendents where they're debating, and I think everyone is assuming that activities means more than just virtual instruction. But again, I will call DESE first thing in the morning just to get clarity.
David, is it possible to leave that piece out and then revise when we're ready to add that piece in when we have more information?
We could, but I think that for the public, this is a very important component of the statement, because the concern is that students are effectively going to be punished for being honest about experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and staying home. Because if they're going to be marked absent, then they might not be as forthcoming about their symptoms. They might not get tested. So the attendance part is important. Now, we could approve this statement without that sentence and then hope that by tomorrow, when we consider this as a full school committee, that we'll have an answer to that question. I don't know, though, that we'll have an answer in time for tomorrow. It's not absolutely critical that we pass this tomorrow, so maybe it could wait a bit longer, but there definitely is a clamor from many members of the public to, at minimum, have a statement of commitment from us.
I guess my question, and maybe you could elaborate, David, is a commitment of what? Like, what is the clamoring a commitment of? What is it that people want a commitment of?
That we care about making sure our students are going to have access to learning, even if they are at home due to symptoms of COVID-19, or because they have COVID-19, or because they're quarantining due to protocols.
It feels like our statement does say that. It's the piece about the absent or not absent that's the issue. So it's not, right now, I think what we have is a commitment to learning going on. It sounds to me, listening to everybody talk, that the issue is about the being marked absent or not. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, that would be the missing piece if we take out that sentence.
But it sounds like we don't actually know what DESE really means by activities. And so to Andy's point, we don't know what we're committing to in order to say we commit to it.
All we're actually committing to, by the way it's worded, is that we will be consistent with DESE regulations. So whatever they are, we're saying we would follow them.
Oh, well, that makes sense. I mean, we have to follow the DESE regulations anyways. So, I mean.
So even if we don't know what they are, we're just saying we're going to be consistent with them.
Okay.
You know, I wonder, David, just to this point, I mean, I know that, for example, there are different consequences. We spent a fair amount of time, I'm sorry, Helen's not on anymore, but we spent a fair amount of time a number of years ago talking about the consequences of having too many absences. And at the high school level, there are real consequences for that in terms of being able to participate in certain activities and whatnot. And so I wonder if there's something we could also, via Leslie or Casey or someone else, get a little bit more clarity from the principals as to what is it that they're hearing people are concerned about. And if there are things that are just on the absence policy in particular, if there are things that we need to relax because they're internal to Brookline policies, or then we just have to look at those as well. And so maybe just on I think you're right. One piece of it is the commitment to learning and education, even if their children are out, that they won't, miss out on the education piece. But I think the other piece is maybe a little bit more procedural, and maybe we can just separate those a little bit so that we don't, because they do seem like they kind of run in parallel, but they're a little bit different.
And Susan, that's in line with what I've seen just researching other districts, is that they're talking a lot about in FAQs just about how to de-incentivize coming to school sick. And I'm looking at some language now from several places that just they're putting language in place that kind of eases back on absences, and where typically prior to COVID, we were pushing people to come to school. We're doing things differently now. And so that's some of the language that has to happen. And certainly, like you're saying, at the high school, I think that's an even more important conversation just because of how fast the content moves, and the other implications for being, when you're absent. So I can certainly work on that with Anthony.
So how about this as a compromise? In that sentence about the consistent with DESE attendance regulations, take out the part receiving instruction from outside the school building. So just reads, the school committee further expects that students will be marked present consistent with Department of Elementary and Secondary Education attendance regulations. I mean, that's obvious. We have to do that anyway. So if we're not going to, we just take out the part of that sentence about instruction from outside of the school building. So that way it doesn't look like we might be overpromising. We're just stating a fact. So we're going to be consistent with DESE regulations.
David, I think I'm okay with that. I mean, we have to do we have to follow the DESE regulations. So we're just stating what we have to do without getting into the detail. And I do think that's, something the district can specify.
I would change the wording slightly to we expect that students may be marked present if this is consistent with DESE regulations. is that your intended meaning?
Not exactly. I mean, I would expect that whatever the regulations are, we're going to adhere to them.
It's just that the current wording would be that, like, well, you will be marked present, and that is consistent with DESI regulations, and we can't promise that.
Okay, we can word it that way, I don't mind. So the school committee further expects that students may be marked present if this is consistent with Department of Elementary and Secondary Education attendance regulations. I don't know about may. If we're putting it as a conditional, it might as well be will.
Will, that's fine, yeah.
I was gonna say, or in accordance with, does that cover your concern, Andy?
Well, no, because that's sort of David's wording where, like, you will be marked present in accordance with DESI regulations. That suggests that according to DESI regulations, you are considered present, but we can't guarantee that because we're not sure we can meet that standard. So we're happy to mark you present as long as what you've done that day turns out to be consistent with DESI's guidelines for that, right? But we're not really sure whether that will be the case because we may not actually be able to offer you enough stuff to do.
I think that's fine. So the school committee further expects that students will be marked present if this is consistent with Department of Elementary and Secondary Education attendance regulations.
Yeah, I like that.
And we can explain when we get the inevitable question, well, is it consistent or not? We can read the precise language and that it remains a bit of a moving target and a bit ambiguous, and we're hoping to pin down what exactly qualifies as an activity.
And we may have done so before tomorrow night. Okay?
Yes. All right, any other thoughts? Okay, would someone like to move this? All right, thank you, Valerie. Is there a second? Thank you, Andy. All right, Andy?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
Jennifer?
Sure, yes.
And I also vote yes. Okay, so next up, is there any new business? All right, seems like there isn't. So thank you everyone for joining this evening. A lot of important work got done today and we go at it again on both of these items tomorrow. Jennifer, go ahead.
Sorry, just following up, we are still meeting next week. Is that correct? I don't know if that qualifies as new business. I'm just checking that we have a meeting on the calendar and.
We are. There is the potential that it'll get pushed back to either later in the day or possibly even another day because Susan had sent out an email about the sort of the ceremonial.
And the groundbreaking at Driscoll.
Right, the groundbreaking at Driscoll, which would interfere with which overlaps with our meeting. So we might want to readjust the schedule, but I'll get back to you soon on that.
Okay, that sounds great.
The Driscoll groundbreaking is going to be from 4 to 4:30. It's going to be short. And then people can stay and take pictures if they want to, but it's not a long thing. We're all standing around outside, just so folks know. So I apologize for that. It's very short.
Okay. Anything else? All right, well, thank you very much, everyone. And we'll be discussing these policies again tomorrow with the full school committee. Bye.